Ukraine says its navy has sunk a Russian landing ship in the occupied port city of Berdyansk. It comes as President Volodymyr Zelensky appeals to the world to take to the streets in a universal show of solidarity. Russia continues to hit Ukraine's major cities with airstrikes and artillery. But Ukrainians have prevented Russian takeovers in several locations. The UN says the conflict has already driven half of Ukraine's children from their homes.
In a hospital in Kyiv, Olya is feeding her daughter Victoria, who is just 1 month old. The baby survived Russian shelling because her mother used her body as a shield. Her father recounts how their apartment block was targeted.
I woke up because Olya was screaming, and it was accompanied by the sound of glass crashing, an alarm, fire, a catastrophe. I just heard Olya shouting, turned over and threw a blanket over them.
Attacks on residential areas, schools and hospitals have become a daily occurrence in the war. With Russian troops mostly stalled outside Ukraine's main cities, they are resorting to bombing from afar. Ukraine is fighting back. Its navy reported that it destroyed a large Russian landing ship in the port city of Berdyansk, a boost for Ukraine's forces. President Volodymyr Zelensky is also working to build up morale and garner international support.
Come to your squares, your streets, make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters. Russia is trying to defeat the freedom of all people in Europe, of all the people in the world. It tries to show that only crude and cruel force matters.
Despite the destruction Russia has wrought, Ukraine says it will not give up fighting. But the price of its defiance is a country laid to waste.
We can take you now to the Ukrainian capital. DW correspondent Matthias Böllinger is in Kyiv. Matthias, how are things in and around Kyiv?
Yeah, we have just returned to Kyiv. We've been away for a week in the western part of the country, and the mood has changed slightly here. We see more shops open. For example, hairdressers are open now. They used to be closed. Most of the shops are still closed, but a few more businesses are operating. You see more people on the street. You see more traffic. So it feels like the city is making its way back to normalcy in very small steps. It is, of course, still a city in an extraordinary situation. You can still hear shelling and in daytime and at night from the outskirts. The Ukrainians have driven the Russians a bit further away from the city. That's at least what we hear. But the fighting is close enough that you can hear it even if you are in the city center. However, there seems to be like the trend seems to have shifted a little bit. That's the feeling here on the ground.
That's really interesting, that perspective that you bring us there, Matthias. What does that tell you? Is there growing optimism that they're able to hold off Russian troops from capturing Kyiv?
That's the mood at the moment. The Russian troops have tried to capture Kyiv. Everybody understands or estimates that that was their top priority, to capture Kyiv, quickly decapitate the government, and it has not worked. Moreover, while Russian troops have advanced to these places around Kyiv where they are now quite quickly, they have almost been unable to make any gains within 3 weeks or so, and we've also seen some signs that they are digging trenches now, that this is moving towards a war of attrition rather than an invasion or an advance, and that's obviously something that gives people here the hope that the Russians that Ukraine might be able to drive the Russians out in the end, or to create a situation, Terry has said this before, where the Russians would understand that they cannot achieve their goal, and then in negotiations they could be convinced to leave the country. That's the hope now. It's still not where we are. It's nothing that people expect to happen in the next few weeks or so, but it's something that could be a possible outcome in the longer term. There's very careful, but some optimism is here.
Mm-hmm. Very cautious optimism indeed. Unfortunately, in other parts of Ukraine, Russian strikes have repeatedly hit soft targets, mostly civilian targets. Is this the main tactic that is being employed by Russian military in other parts of Ukraine?
Yeah, it looks like this because the shelling has been much too massive. The shelling of residential quarters in Mariupol and Kharkiv has been too massive to see this as an accident, and a lot of people have died, of course. It seems to be a tactics to demotivate the people there, to pressure people into submission, or to make them leave the cities in order to make it easier for the military to capture them. All these are theories. What could be behind it? What we know for sure is that it is a tactics that Russia has used before. Russia has massively bombed Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in the 1990s. Russia has massively bombed Aleppo, the stronghold of the opposition in Syria, with no regard to civilians. Hospitals bombed, kindergartens, schools bombed systematically. So there are no illusions that this might be anything else but deliberate.
DW correspondent Matthias Billinger reporting from Kyiv. Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you. Let's take a look at the other developments in the war. A reporter working for an independent Russian website has been killed in Kyiv. News outlet The Insider said Oksana Baulina died when Russian forces shelled a suburb where she had been filming damage from an attack. At least 5 journalists have now died since Russian troops invaded Ukraine 4 weeks ago. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, has held talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. The Red Cross president told Russia it must abide by international laws on humanitarian conduct in war. Mr. Maurer also plans to discuss the issue of prisoners of war with defense officials. The UN estimates that 10 million people in Ukraine have fled their homes, about a quarter of the population. While many have found shelter in other parts of Ukraine, more than 3.5 million people have left the country altogether. While now a small number of Ukrainians are returning. DW's Fanny Fashar reports from Lviv.
They escaped horror. Their last stretch, boarding one of these trains to Poland. Lyuba and her 2 grandchildren took 4 days to get here from Kharkiv, a city heavily bombed.
At home in Balaklia in the Kharkiv region, horrible things are happening. There are bombings. Dead bodies are lying around in the village. 2 villages were completely destroyed.
Her grandchild, 16-year-old Kirill, doesn't know if he will ever return to Ukraine.
I will stay with my parents in Poland. I will study and live there somehow.
The images of people fleeing Ukraine, most of them women and children, ingrained. However, a small but growing number is headed back to Ukraine, most of them men ready to fight, but it's estimated 1 in 5 is a woman. A woman like Lilia, a designer. She fled from Kyiv on the day the war began to France. Now she is back.
It's impossible to leave my team behind. I need to give people jobs, faith in the future. That's why I'm here. My return is about supporting Ukraine and those who don't know whether to return or what to do, how to live.
Shaken by the brutality of this war, she says she wants to secure jobs for her team, who all had to flee from Kyiv. She's able to give work again. In this wedding dress factory, she found a temporary workspace.
My message to all women who are abroad and who may think about returning and what to do here, I want to tell them, we have the strongest men in the world. We will win and can overcome anything.
Despite the optimism, the war is present here too. Our interview interrupted by air raid sirens.
Oh, the air raid siren again.
Girls, if you want to go down, go. Oh, it's terrible.
The siren is going on?
Yeah.
I'm afraid because it's unpredictable.
Бо тут така ситуація непредсказуема, так, але
We need to stay alive.
продовжувати жити.
The factory can be a target too, Lilia explains, as we head to the bunker. But just how responsible is it to ask others to return to Ukraine now? Lilia makes clear
Кожен відповідальний за
Everyone is responsible for their own actions.
Кожен приймаємо рішення за себе.
And everyone decides for themselves what they do, what they say, the choices they make, what Ukraine means to them. This is my choice.
Я вибрала зараз так.
and the consequence of their choice of leaving or returning plays out here at this train station in Lviv.
Jenny Mathers is an expert in Russian politics and security at Aberystwyth University in the UK, and she joins us now. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking out the time to take our questions. We're marking a month into this unprovoked war, and it seems like the Russian invasion has stalled. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's two reasons, really. The first is the resistance of the Ukrainians, and they have been, fantastic, really, in putting up a strong fight against the Russian invaders. Civil society has rallied around. So the strength of the Ukrainians has been a major part of why Russia's invasion has stalled. But of course, the other side of that is the quality of the Russian strategy and the Russian forces, the preparation or apparently the lack of preparation, because what we've seen is that they were apparently prepared for just a very short operation. They expected to meet very little resistance. They expected to be able to get straight to the capital, remove the president, replace him with a puppet regime, and rule the country that way. And when that didn't happen, they didn't seem to be capable of switching strategies to a different way of operating and supplying their troops sufficiently in order to do that.
Mm. Now, unfortunately, we've got the specter of chemical or biological warfare looming large. President Zelensky has accused Russia of using phosphorus bombs in Ukraine. If that is the case, would this mark a new stage in the war in Ukraine?
I think it does. I think also it's worth remembering that, Putin has defied all logic and expectation of what we would expect Russia to do in order to, maximize his advantages, in order to try and gain the kinds of victories that are achievable in the circumstances. So he's thrown the rule book out the window. And so the problem is we really don't know what to expect next from him. So yes, new, more frightening weapons, crossing lines which are, regarded as international taboos. Unfortunately, we can't rule those things out any longer.
Has it become impossible for President Putin to retreat?
It's not impossible for him to retreat, but he probably regards it that way, if that makes sense. So in other words, he could certainly find a face-saving way out if he wanted to. The problem is there's no evidence whatsoever that he is interested in backing down. The only limitations on what he's willing to do seems to be with capacity, with the resources that he's got, the constraints provided by what his soldiers are willing and able to do, rather than any sort of moral or ethical issues or even any sort of consideration of cost-benefit analysis when he's gone too far. He doesn't seem to have that sort of a boundary in terms of this war.
And final thoughts in a few words, if you can. I mean, I know it's very difficult because, we find ourselves at a time of great uncertainty. People are talking about the possibility of World War III breaking out, the use of nuclear weapons. Is this war going to upend everything that we know?
It's definitely a watershed. It's a watershed in terms of, how the post-Cold War world is developing. And, certainties that we thought we could rely upon over the last 30 years have suddenly vanished. So although we still hope very much that the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons will remain. Nevertheless, as I said, Putin has gone to the stage where outside observers are finding it very, very difficult to try and predict what he might do next, because we simply don't know what he would rule out.
Jenny Mathers, expert in Russian politics and security at Aberystwyth University. Thank you very much for taking our questions. Very illuminating. As the war in Ukraine enters its second month, NATO leaders are vowing to send more military aid to Kyiv and to strengthen the alliance's eastern frontiers. At an emergency summit of alliance leaders in Brussels, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg confirmed that NATO will send 40,000 more troops to Eastern Europe, and he also warned that Russian use of chemical weapons in Ukraine would, quote, fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. While Mr. Stoltenberg said Russia's invasion of Ukraine had created a new security reality and welcomed pledges from alliance members to increase defense spending.
1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul. And we are responding. But security does not come for free, and doing more will cost more. So NATO leaders agreed to redouble efforts to meet the defense investment pledge we made in 2014. Allies will submit additional plans on how to meet the pledge in time for the Madrid summit in June. And I welcome that a number of allies today announced plans for significant increases in defense spending. At this dangerous time, transatlantic unity and solidarity are vital. Europe and North America are standing and will continue to stand strong together in NATO.
NATO chief speaking moments ago. Let's take you to a NATO headquarters in Brussels. Correspondent Terry Schultz is standing outside. Terry, strong words from NATO Secretary Stoltenberg at the press conference. What stood out for you?
I think, first of all, Leila, was the Secretary General's acknowledgement of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's impassioned plea to NATO to please send more weapons, give us more support. Of course, we know Ukraine wants a no-fly zone. We know NATO continues to reject that. We know that Ukraine wants fighter jets from Poland and other allies that have these MiG-29s. So far, NATO has not managed to send them, and we don't even know where that request is at the moment. But Secretary General Stoltenberg said some allies did step up with more assistance for Ukraine. And there was another interesting thing, Leila. You know, we've talked a lot lately about increasing concerns that Russia would use chemical weapons inside Ukraine and the possibility that the impact from this could contaminate allied territories. Just today, Stoltenberg announced that the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO has activated a special task force inside its rapid reaction forces to look at how to protect allied populations, NATO territory, in the case of a chemical attack. So that says to me that their concern is becoming ever greater, that Russia does plan to use a chemical weapon.
Terrifying prospect. Is the invasion of Ukraine making NATO rethink its options?
Certainly, we don't see any sign that NATO is rethinking going into Ukraine, despite what Stoltenberg has called painful decisions to do that. When you hear the appeals of President Zelensky and other Ukrainians to give them more support, there's certainly no sign that there will be any NATO boots on the ground. We haven't seen these fighter jets be transferred to Ukraine yet, and certainly a no-fly zone is still not on the table.
And NATO essentially not getting involved as long as no NATO member is under threat. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's something that NATO continues to repeat, that its job is to protect NATO members. And of course, Ukraine is not an ally. So what they continue to say is that they will be sending reinforcements to allied countries along the eastern flank. As you mentioned, there will be new battle groups in 4 new countries. And that is something that NATO wants to create, sort of a seamless deterrent effect along its eastern border to deter any thought by Moscow that they would step 1 foot into NATO territory. So that will continue. And the other thing that is new this week is that NATO says these are going to be longer-term deployments. They were initially expected to be rotating deployments in these 8 countries. Now he says, you know, the new reality in Europe's security means we're going to have to stay put there as long as Russia's stance is as it is today.
And the Secretary General had also a message for China.
That's right. China was mentioned in the leader statement put out at the end of the meeting, and we've heard President Biden, for example, and Secretary General Stoltenberg say this before. But once again, now in black and white, telling China to stay out of this, to not respond to Russia's request to help supply weapons or other technological capacities that it may be lacking due to sanctions. The leader statement says, China, you are a member of the UN Security Council. Your job is to try to keep the world peaceful, and we expect you to do that.
And in conclusion, just some final thoughts from you, Terry. What is NATO trying to signal to President Putin?
Certainly the message remains the same, even though President Putin has not heeded it so far and did go ahead with this invasion into Ukraine. What Stoltenberg said today numerous times was that Putin has made a strategic mistake. Obviously, the Russian assault is not going as well as Moscow had hoped. So NATO is trying to make Putin rethink this and possibly pull out of Ukraine. We don't see any sign that is happening, but of course, we do see that the Russian troops are either stalled or having to regroup, bring in more resources. So certainly this is a moment when NATO feels it may be able to convince President Putin that this war is not going to be won. The Ukrainians are doing much better than people expected. And I think while there is no diplomacy underway at the moment, they hope that in the Kremlin, people are rethinking this war that they've launched.
Terry Schultz reporting from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Terry, thank you very much.